Good day, everyone. My name is Biandri Joubert, and I'll be sharing thoughts on some critical next steps in the trade in wild meat across the African continent. My presentation focuses on selected critical next steps that are derived from research that I did for AWEI towards the end of last year. The research focused broadly on the question that I pose in this slide. What are significant barriers to the formal intra-African meat trade, and what steps can be taken to resolve them? Two sets of recommendations were developed following the outcomes of last year's research. A finding of the research was that the barriers faced by the wild meat industry are not all barriers that the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 mechanism can reasonably be expected to resolve. The critical next steps presented on today focus on the second category of recommendations, which relate to matters broader than the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 NTB mechanism itself. The full reports and summaries are available on AWEI's website. So, with policy recommendations and research reports written, what are the critical next steps? How do we move forward with wild meat trade in Africa? This research had initially set out to evaluate aspects of the 𝐓𝐡𝐞's non-tariff barrier reporting, monitoring, and elimination mechanism, and I set out to consider whether it is an appropriate forum of dispute resolution for barriers within the scope of this research. The research was conducted in different phases, which included stakeholder engagement and a review of literature. The process of identifying non-tariff barriers that are broadly experienced within the industry that restrict the formal wildlife meat trade led to the development of policy outcomes and recommendations, including the critical next steps discussed today. The African Continental Free Trade Area has the potential to liberalize trade in Africa, and in today's discussion, we look at the trade in wild meat in particular. Before we get to the critical next steps, the question that a lot of you are probably asking by now is, what is the 𝐓𝐶FTA? 𝐓𝐶FTA stands for African Continental Free Trade Area, or some people use it interchangeably to refer to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or the agreement between 55 different African countries. So it is an agreement between African countries that create a continental free trade area, which essentially focuses on the reduction of tariffs and the removal of non-tariff barriers. It is intended to be a driver of economic growth and development within the continent. The 𝐓𝐶FTA is one of the flagship projects of the African Union's Agenda 2063, called the Africa We Want. It is ambitious, and the African Continental Free Trade Area is the world's largest free trade area with 55 member states in one market. By eliminating barriers to trade in Africa, the objective of the 𝐓𝐶FTA is to significantly boost intra-African trade, but particularly trade in value-added production and trade across all sectors of Africa's economy. There are over 1 billion people within the 𝐓𝐶FTA, which amounts to an estimated $3.4 trillion market within this free trade area. The agreement between 55 African countries to develop a free trade area holds significant potential for a variety of industries, and we at AWEI believe there is potential for this to include wild meat. However, for the trading potential to be reached, there are things that need to change and barriers that need to be removed in order for the 𝐓𝐶FTA to be a success, further than the trading potential that currently exists. So the 𝐓𝐶FTA creates an opportunity for safe, sustainable trade in wild meat. And there are a number of things that do need to change in order for that to become a reality, and in order for that potential to further develop this industry within the continent to become something that is accessible to everyday people involved in the industry in a very practical and very meaningful way. This leads me to some critical next steps. The concentration on the next steps presented here today, as opposed to some of the larger recommendations and the policy recommendations, for example, the reform of a legal framework, is for two reasons. The first is that these critical next steps are exactly that. Getting them right is essential to progress with more technical discussions surrounding the reform of legislation, for example. The second reason is that they are attainable in shorter time frames, and the implementation will already alleviate some immediate barriers. To the extent that these critical next steps are already in process and also championed by other researchers, this presentation serves as a re-emphasis of the urgency for it. I go into as much detail as possible in the next steps. However, and crucially, I should emphasize that the further elaboration of the details in each step are not the work for a single researcher. Interdisciplinarity will be essential to truly benefit in these next steps, and richer, constructive, and actionable further engagement with active participants in the wild meat trade should form part of any actual steps taken. The first critical next step that I'd like to focus on is the definition of HS codes specific to wild meat beyond the six-digit HS code level. So when speaking in international trade terms, it is vital that we speak in a language that fits the context and also provides the requisite clarity. HS codes provide the potential clarity needed to clearly communicate about volumes and values of specific categories of wild meat traded in the continent. Clarity of HS codes beyond a six-digit level will not only facilitate eased movement across borders and potentially avoid delays in the movement of perishable products, but it will also start to develop a clearer picture of the more precise economic value of formally traded wild meat and valuable data for the industry. The second critical next step is the harmonization of what we mean when we speak of wild meat in the context of trading wild meat in the African continent. What does that mean? What does that include? What doesn't that include? Once we know what is or isn't included when we speak of wild meat, or under what conditions meat from wildlife is or isn't included in the wild meat dialogue, the steps for identifying and clarifying HS codes and developing standards become possible. It is necessary to harmonize and standardize at a continental level what wild meat is or is not in the commercial sense in the wild meat industry. The certainty that language and definition provides can further ease standardization of import and export guidelines and protocols. The standards should be set by consultation within industry and contain details that distinguish the understanding of what wildlife meat is or is not in terms of ranching practices, veterinary intervention, etc. Next, I want to focus on the development of harmonized standards and protocols, both private and national, for the harvesting and sale of wild meat. Where national standards are absent or inadequate, develop private standards for the harvesting of wild meat in the AFCFTA area. It is important that these be accessible and are accompanied by accessible and up-to-date import and export guidelines per category of wildlife meat, where this is necessary, of course, and per country in the AFCFTA. Countries such as Namibia already have examples of how this can be done. And building on examples and existing research and new research, the development of harmonized standards and protocols really provides a lot of potential for engaging with the potential of this free trade area. Next, I focus on the development of an open AFCFTA database. On the screen are just two examples of what I believe would be useful in terms of critical next steps to be contained in such an AFCFTA database. I emphasize that when I say open, I mean with free access, without having to undergo a registration or payment or that type of thing in order to access this type of information. Should be open and technically sound, including information such as technical templates and trade literature to accompany, as I give the example here, specialized permit requests and that type of thing. Taking steps towards sharing open technical information is vital in the process of getting as many countries involved in the wild meat trade as possible. It is a way of sharing resources, it is a way of sharing expertise, and it is a way of ensuring that this expertise and resources are equitably distributed throughout the continent and enable the access to this market equally. or as equal as possible within the AFCFTA. The next and second last critical next step that I refer to today is guiding stakeholders through the foundations and core concepts of international trade. I recommend the development of further training material to guide stakeholders through a broad overview of the foundations and core concepts of international trade to facilitate further engagement with and insight into the potential of the AFCFTA. Examples such as those developed and shared by AWEI earlier in the year already exist, and there remains scope for further development and concentration on the needs of the wild meat industry. Foundations and core concepts of international trade are really something that is critical in the as immediate future as possible to empower participants within the wild meat trade to enable further engagement on practical ways to incorporate such concepts, rights, obligations, and that type of thing into the steps towards removing the existing barriers within the industry and moving towards a point where wild meat is safely and sustainably moved across borders within the continent and done so within this formal market, with, of course, the understanding of what we mean when we speak of wild meat in the international trade context, and of course having the data necessary through the form of HS codes to be able to track what the success is or what the volumes are or the values are of this type of international trade. The last critical next step that I reflect on here is inter-industry collaboration. When I say inter-industry here, I don't just mean within the wild meat industry, but within the broader livestock industry and animal health industry within the continent as well. Many diseases are equally trade prohibitive, regardless of whether this is within the livestock industry or within the wild meat industry within which it breaks out. And that's just one example. So there must be cooperation between commercially orientated and hobby-focused wildlife producers in the reporting, control of, and prevention of animal diseases. And there must also be cooperation and collaboration with both the formal and informal livestock industries. It is recommended that technical, and when I say technical in this context, I mean specifically veterinary and trade literature and training material be developed to create awareness of the importance of actions to take towards greater animal health and disease prevention. There are solutions that already exist in this industry regarding trading from areas where certain diseases are endemic, and using existing literature and existing ideas to build on this type of collaboration could really, in the short term, be something that significantly benefits the industry. But importantly, inter-industry collaboration here is vital because the wild meat industry is reliant on disease-free statuses in the same way that the livestock industry is for access to other markets. When I say other markets, in this case, I mean export markets. Thank you for listening, and please get in touch via email or AWEI if you have any further questions. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, the summaries and reports and policy recommendations that underlie the critical next steps that I have reflected on here today are available on the AWEI website, and we welcome any further engagement on any of these topics. Thank you and have a lovely day.